They called him a gold digger at his husband's funeral, until his husband's secret lover stood in the aisle as a powerful story about love, betrayal, and legacy. At the funeral of billionaire Cassian Ward, Nathaniel, his longtime partner, was seated in the front pew, quietly grieving. Yet all around him, whispers spread like poison. He's just a gold digger. The Ward family gave him cold stares, refusing to recognize the 8 years he and Cassian shared. But just as the service reached its peak, the doors creaked open, and a well-dressed stranger entered. His name Leo, Cassian's secret lover. He stood before everyone and revealed a hidden truth: Cassian had lived a double life. Then came the will, and with it, a shocking condition: both Nathaniel and Leo must live together in Cassian's estate for 6 months, completing intimate, emotional challenges to prove who truly understood the man behind the mask. This story unfolds into a stunning pattern of love, memory, and identity, with a legacy hanging in the balance. Nathaniel adjusted the black silk tie at his throat. It felt a little too tight. A real discomfort amidst a scene where everything ought to have been pure, unadulterated grief. He sat there, in the first pew of the old chapel, the one reserved for Cassian Ward's most beloved. The early autumn air, already cool, seemed no match for the iciness emanating from the Peters behind him, where the Ward family was seated. Every soft sniffle, every carefully suppressed cough, every glance that swept over him, however fleeting, Nathaniel felt it all, especially the gaze of Julian, Cassian's younger brother, sharp and openly scrutinizing. Julian sat ramrod straight, his gray eyes, so like Cassian's, held none of the warmth that once was, only a cold, distant appraisal. Nathaniel knew that in their eyes, he was likely an outsider, an unwelcome presence in this somber, wealthy family tableau. The 8 years he and Cassian had shared, 8 years of quiet joys and unspoken undercurrents. Perhaps to them, it was all just a faint, forgettable chapter, or worse, one they wished to erase. He took a slow, deep breath, trying to let the pure scent of white lilies calm the turmoil within him. His hands clasped tightly on his knees, fingernails pressing into his palms, a small anchor to maintain the necessary composure. He had to present the facade of a grieving partner, a man who had just lost the great love of his life. And indeed, a part of him did feel an empty, hollow ache. But intertwined with that was another sensation, a tense anticipation, a vague notion of what was to unfold once the velvet curtain of this funeral finally closed. Cassian, the man with the hearty laugh and plans that always defied anyone's predictions, could he truly have departed so quietly? Or was this, too, merely a part of a grander play he had meticulously orchestrated? Nathaniel found his gaze drifting toward the flower-laden casket, an unspoken question echoing silently in his mind. The service was proceeding with its solemn, somewhat heavy rites. Prayers droned on, somber and steady. An elderly pastor, with a kind face and a gentle voice, was recounting the memorable milestones of Cassian Ward's life, carefully selected memories. Of course, the most beautiful chapters one would wish to preserve. Nathaniel tried to let himself be carried by those words, to find a measure of peace, however temporary, amidst the storm still raging in his heart. Then, almost tearing through that quiet atmosphere, the heavy oak doors of the chapel creaked open. The groan of the hinges was like a discordant note, ushering in a harsh shaft of light from the corridor beyond, causing a few attendees to squint. And then, a figure slowly materialized, each step seemingly deliberate, drawing every eye. It was a young man, perhaps just past 30. His auburn hair was meticulously styled, and the suit he wore, a deep sapphire blue, expertly tailored, stood out starkly in a sea of funeral black and gray. He didn't seem rushed, quite the contrary. There was an air of confidence about him that bordered on ostentatious. His amber eyes quickly scanned the chapel, pausing for a moment on Cassian's flower-draped casket. Then, just as quickly, shifting to meet Nathaniel's. The already tense atmosphere seemed to solidify, to freeze. Whispers erupted like a startled flock of birds, then just as quickly fell silent as the stranger advanced. Julian, Cassian's brother, narrowed his dark brows, his lips pressing into a thin, hard line, an unmistakable sign of displeasure and perhaps a hint of contempt. The stranger stopped halfway down the main aisle, just a few paces from the front pew. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and rather high-pitched, yet it carried a peculiar force, enough to shatter the strained silence that had enveloped the room. "Forgive this sudden intrusion, but I believe Cassian would not have wished his final farewell to lack the presence of the one with whom he truly shared his soul, his most intimate confidant." Nathaniel felt his heart lurch, as if it had missed a beat. He stared at the man, trying to dredge up any memory of having met this figure before, at any time, but all he found was a baffling blank. The stranger seemed largely unfazed by the palpable disquiet of those around him. He continued, his voice tinged with emotion, yet his eyes flashed with a defiant spark, especially when he glanced towards the members of the Ward family. "My name is Leo, and I know most of you here, even those who considered themselves closest to Cassian, have never once heard my name. That is because Cassian, due to the invisible pressures that you yourselves placed upon him, had to choose to keep our relationship a secret. He feared judgment, he feared unnecessary pain, but today I cannot stand by and watch him depart in a silence so full of pretense and arrangement. Because, ladies and gentlemen, I was the one Cassian chose to share his most secret dreams with, his deepest fears, and also his simplest, most ordinary joys." A profound, breathless silence enveloped the chapel, as if an unseen bomb had just been detonated. Nathaniel could almost see a flicker of something, a nearly imperceptible, grim satisfaction, cross Julian's face. The other attendees, however, made no attempt to hide their utter astonishment. They turned to look at one another, then at Nathaniel, then back at Leo, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief, as if they were witnessing an unexpected, dramatic scene suddenly added to a meticulously rehearsed play. Indeed, life sometimes presents us with situations so ironic, so unexpected, that even those directly involved cannot fully comprehend them. It reminds one of the stories we often hear in the real world, that behind every closed door, within every family, every relationship, there can lie layers of secrets that an outsider can scarcely fathom. The small lesson we might see here, perhaps, is that life is not always as smooth or predictable as we might imagine. The appearance of unexpected elements, of strangers carrying their own narratives, can indeed change everything. It reminds us that sometimes what we see is merely the tip of a colossal iceberg. Nathaniel took a slow, deep breath, trying to keep his face from betraying the maelstrom of emotions churning within him. He looked directly at Leo, the man who had so boldly proclaimed himself Cassian's secret love, his soulmate. A complex, almost unidentifiable feeling rose within him. It wasn't quite jealousy, as one might expect, nor was it entirely anger or indignation. Rather, it was an intense curiosity, mingled with a touch of disbelief and perhaps a vague, bitter taste. Cassian, the man he thought he had known so intimately after all their years together, now appeared in a new light, more multifaceted, more enigmatic, and perhaps even more of a stranger. Leo's words still seemed to hang in the thick, heavy air of the chapel, heralding an unavoidable confrontation, a truth on the verge of being exposed. And it seemed the drama that Cassian had quietly authored while alive was only now truly beginning its most climactic act. All eyes, by unspoken accord, were now fixed on the front of the chapel, where the casket lay, dignified and silent. But the secrets entombed around it were beginning to stir, as if demanding to escape, to be laid bare in the stark light of truth. Who would be next to draw back this veil of mystery? And more importantly, Cassian's last will and testament, what astonishing revelations would it soon unveil? The funeral service eventually concluded, leaving in its wake an atmosphere thick with unspoken emotions. Following the somewhat formal condolences and a barrage of knowing glances, the Ward family, Nathaniel and Leo, the uninvited guest, were guided to a private chamber within the church grounds. It was a small room, rather stifling, with its dark wood-paneled walls and a long table set in the center. Mr. Alistair Finch, the solicitor who had served the Ward family for generations, his silver hair immaculate and his gold-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose, was already seated, waiting. On the table before him, a thick, carefully sealed envelope lay inert, like a hibernating creature, biding its time. The tension was so palpable, one could almost hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Mr. Finch cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound that broke the heavy silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice a monotone, devoid of any discernible emotion. "We are gathered here today to fulfill one of Mr. Cassian Ward's final wishes, the reading of his last will and testament." A sharp, almost predatory glint sparked in Julian's eyes. Leo leaned back slightly in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, his expression a curious mixture of anticipation and defiance. As for Nathaniel, he simply remained silent, consciously trying to keep his breathing steady, though his heart was beating faster than usual. He had a premonition, a nagging feeling that what was about to be read would be anything but straightforward. And Nathaniel's intuition, it turned out, was unerringly correct. Mr. Finch slowly broke the seal, withdrawing a sheaf of meticulously typed pages. He began to read, each word enunciated with deliberate clarity. The initial clauses of the will were fairly conventional, listing a few minor bequests, some charitable donations to organizations Cassian had favored. But then Mr. Finch's voice hitched for a fraction of a second before he proceeded to the most crucial part, the section dictating the fate of the vast fortune Cassian had left behind. Regarding the bulk of the real estate, the investment portfolios, and the valuable art collection, Mr. Finch continued, his eyes fixed majoras on the document. Mr. Cassian Ward has made a most particular stipulation. An almost absolute silence now gripped the room. It is his expressed desire that this portion of his estate be awarded to the individual who can most persuasively demonstrate the deepest love for and the most profound understanding of his person. Between two gentlemen, Mr. Nathaniel Brooks and Mr. Leo Maxwell. Both Nathaniel and Leo visibly started, their shock to palpable. Julian, however, merely allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smirk to touch his lips. Mr. Finch carried on as if oblivious to the reactions of those present. Specifically, within a period of 6 months from this day, Mr. Nathaniel Brooks and Mr. Leo Maxwell shall jointly manage and reside at the Golden Deer Valley estate, a place Mr. Cassian considered his truest sanctuary. During this time, they will be required to work together to decipher a series of mementos, journals, and challenges that Mr. Cassian secretly arranged beforehand. These challenges are not designed to test knowledge or financial acumen, but rather to test patience, compassion, and above all, the depth of each man's understanding of the most hidden recesses of Mr. Cassian's soul. Mr. Finch paused, pushing his spectacles slightly further up the bridge of his nose. The outcome will be assessed by a 3-person panel, chaired by myself and including Mr. Julian Ward, here, a slight nod in Julian's direction, and an independent psychological expert to be appointed by me. If, after 6 months, the panel cannot determine a clear victor, or if both gentlemen fail to complete the challenges satisfactorily, the entirety of this aforementioned inheritance shall be transferred to a Ward family trust, with Mr. Julian Ward appointed as sole trustee, to be used for community development purposes as stipulated by said trust. The solicitor's final words fell like a hammer blow. This was no ordinary will. It was, unmistakably, a game, orchestrated by Cassian with a chilling finesse and a touch of cruelty, even from beyond the grave. He had transformed love, loss, and his very legacy into an arena, where those he had been close to were now forced to confront one another, to lay bare their emotions, and perhaps their own calculations. Nathaniel felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He glanced at Leo, whose expression was a mirror of his own, shifting from stunned disbelief to bewildered confusion. then hardening with a strange new resolve. Julian, meanwhile, maintained an unnervingly placid demeanor, as if everything was proceeding exactly as he had anticipated. Indeed, in life, we often hear tales of peculiar wills, of eccentric conditions imposed by the deceased upon their heirs or loved ones remaining behind. Perhaps it is a way some individuals attempt to maintain their power and influence, even when they are no longer of this world. Or maybe, it is simply a final, desperate attempt to seek some truth, an answer to questions they could not resolve in life. The small lesson here, it might be, is that human nature is inherently complex, and even in the most solemn moments, calculations and power plays can subtly weave their way in. A legacy, you see, is not always just about material wealth. Sometimes, it carries with it an emotional burden, a series of trials that the living must face and overcome. Nathaniel and Leo, two strangers, were now bound together by an invisible thread of fate, spun by Cassian himself. They were rivals, competitors in a bizarre contest where the prize was a fortune, but the cost could prove to be far greater. Would they choose to fight each other to the bitter end? Or would some form of reluctant cooperation emerge from these trying circumstances? And what secrets of Cassian's awaited their discovery in Golden Deer Valley? The curtain, it seemed, had only just risen on the most thrilling act of this intricate play. The small room remained steeped in silence long after Finch had finished his pronouncements. The words of the will still hung in the air, heavy and oppressive, like thunderclouds gathering before a greater storm. Nathaniel felt his throat go dry. He glanced over at Leo, the other man, after the initial moments of stunned disbelief. Now wore a frown. His amber eyes narrowed in thought, a slender finger tapping an erratic rhythm against the arm of his chair. It appeared he too was struggling to process the outlandish conditions they had just heard. Julian Ward was the first to break the spell. He rose, leisurely adjusting his expensive suit jacket, then spoke, his voice laced with an ill-concealed, almost venomous satisfaction. "Well then, everything seems quite clear. I wish you both the best of luck with the little contest my dear brother so thoughtfully arranged. I shall be most interested to observe your efforts." With that, he gave a curt nod to Mr. Finch and swept from the room, his ramrod straight back radiating an undeniable air of smug triumph. Once the door clicked shut behind Julian, the room seemed to grow even more confining. Mr. Finch politely gathered his documents, informing them that his office would be in contact shortly to arrange the necessary procedures for their move to the Golden Deer Valley estate. Then he too excused himself, leaving Nathaniel and Leo alone to face each other and the daunting legacy Cassian had thrust upon them. A long moment of silence stretched between them. Nathaniel was the first to speak, his voice a little hoarse. I don't quite know what to say. This is beyond belief." Leo offered a slight shrug, a gesture tinged with a certain nonchalance. Beyond belief, perhaps, but entirely true. Cassian always did have a fondness for such games, for things that would startle people, force them to scramble. He enjoyed the sensation of being in control, even when... Leo paused, a flicker of sadness briefly shadowing his features. Nathaniel's mind flashed back. Yes, Cassian did have that side to him. He recalled a time Cassian had deliberately hidden a very important birthday gift Nathaniel was expecting, making him search the entire house, following a series of vague clues, all just to savor Nathaniel's expressions, a mix of confusion and eager anticipation. At the time, Nathaniel had dismissed it as a playful, mischievous quirk of his lover. But looking back now, he could see a calculated element, a subtle enjoyment in watching others become entangled in his designs. Had Cassian, he wondered, also plied with Leo in similar ways? So, Leo finally looked up, his gaze meeting Nathaniel's directly. "What do we do now, rival?" There was a soft irony in Leo's tone, but his eyes were not entirely hostile. Perhaps he too recognized the sheer absurdity, the inherent unfairness of their current predicament. Nathaniel considered this in silence. Fight each other. That was undoubtedly what Cassian, and certainly Julian, had expected. They would try to undermine one another, to seize the considerable prize for themselves. But wouldn't that be falling directly into the trap Cassian had so carefully laid, moreover? With Julian acting as supervisor, the very real possibility existed that they would both fail, and the entire estate would then fall neatly into the Ward family's grasp. "I'm not sure," Nathaniel replied slowly, "but I do think if we start tearing at each other's throats from the outset, the only one who truly benefits will be Julian." Leo nodded almost imperceptibly, as if in agreement. "You have a point. Cassian has placed us in a game where it's entirely possible for both of us to lose." He paused for a moment, then continued, his voice now a shade more cautious. Are you proposing some kind of temporary truce and alliance of necessity, perhaps?" The thought of collaborating with the man who claimed to be Cassian's soulmate, a man he hadn't even known existed a few short hours ago, was not a particularly appealing one to Nathaniel. Yet, his reason told him that, under these extraordinary circumstances, it might be the only sensible course of action. Life, it seems, has a peculiar way of throwing people into the most unlikely of situations, where strangers, even adversaries, are forced to find common ground, to rely on one another simply to serve or overcome a shared challenge. One sees this in stories of teams forged from disparate individuals and competitions, or even in those improbable political alliances that sometimes form in the real world. The small lesson here, perhaps, is that cooperation, however reluctant, can sometimes be the very key needed to unlock doors that seemed irrevocably sealed. It requires a setting aside of the ego, a measure of pragmatism, and perhaps even a sliver of tenuous faith in an opponent's capabilities, if only for a time. "Perhaps so," Nathaniel answered, a note of hesitation still in his voice. Cautious cooperation, at least until we understand more about these challenges Cassian has left behind. We need to know what we're truly up against before we decide whether or not to become mortal enemies." Leo studied Nathaniel for a long moment, as if weighing his words, his intentions. Finally, he extended his hand. "All right then, Nathaniel Brooks, cautious cooperation it is, for Cassian, or perhaps, more accurately, for ourselves." Nathaniel looked at the hand suspended before him. It was an offer of a handshake that promised little warmth, no real trust, only a shared calculation and a vaguely defined common goal. But he took it. Their handshake was brief, yet it marked a new turning point in this increasingly complex drama. Two men with two different pasts intertwined with the same deceased man were now about to embark on a shared journey fraught with pitfalls and secrets. At the enigmatic Golden Deer Valley, Julian Ward would undoubtedly be watching their every move, and Cassian himself, from whatever realm he now inhabited, seemed to be smiling faintly, observing the unfolding of the play he had so masterfully set in motion. The journey to the Golden Deer Valley estate unfolded in a heavy, oppressive silence, broken only intermittently by the driver's terse directions. A man arranged by Mr. Finch, the mansion, when it finally came into view, did not feel like the peaceful sanctuary Cassian had often described, at least not to Nathaniel and Leo at that moment. It was magnificent, certainly, opulent even, nestled in splendid isolation amidst sprawling grounds. Yet it exuded an air of loneliness, and perhaps a sense of being under constant, unseen surveillance. Every perfectly manicured corner of the vast gardens, each imposing stone statue, seemed to carry the watchful, judgmental gaze of the Ward family. Those first few days in Golden Deer Valley, Nathaniel and Leo barely spoke to one another, save for the most minimal, necessary exchanges. They were like two wary animals, thrust servicios into the same cage, cautious and keeping their distance. Both were acutely aware that, from somewhere, Julian Ward was monitoring their every move, waiting for a misstep, a crack in their reluctant, cautious cooperation. They began the task of examining the mementos and journals Cassian had left behind, as per the lawyer's instructions. Stacks of old, brittle letters, notebooks filled with an almost indecipherable scrawl, paintings whose allegorical meanings seemed to defy all reasonable interpretation. But Julian Ward was not the type to sit by and wait. Merely a few days after Nathaniel and Leo had commenced their contest, Mr. Finch delivered to them a formal letter, originating from the Ward family and bearing Julian's own signature. The letter's contents, though couched in the most decorous and formal language, carried an unmistakable message of intimidation. Julian expressed his profound concern regarding Cassian's true financial state prior to his demise. He alluded vaguely to risky investments and certain unclarified financial commitments that Cassian might have undertaken. Julian even insinuated that a few of Cassian's former associates were beginning to raise inquiries concerning past transactions. The letter's intent was transparently clear. Julian aimed to sow seeds of doubt, to undermine Nathaniel and Leo's belief in the actual value of the inheritance they were vying for. He wanted them to consider the possibility that what they were striving to attain might be nothing more than an empty shell, or worse, a significant legal liability. His efforts did not stop there. A few days later, a small article surfaced in an obscure local newspaper, detailing leaked information about the somewhat extravagant lifestyle and complex relationships of an unnamed prominent local figure who had recently passed away, leaving behind a disputed fortune. Though no names were explicitly mentioned, anyone with a passing knowledge of local affairs could easily deduce that the article was alluding to Cassian. Julian, with his connections, was clearly employing even the unsavory tactics of a media smear campaign to apply pressure. Nathaniel read the words, a bitter taste rising in his throat. He knew Julian would stop at nothing, but he hadn't anticipated such swift public maneuvering. Leo, after perusing both the letter and the newspaper clipping, let out a short, dry laugh, though his eyes glinted with a barely concealed anger. Cassian's family. They truly don't want anyone outside their circle to touch a single penny, do they? Leo remarked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Such inheritance disputes within wealthy families, dear listeners, are unfortunately not uncommon in the real world. It's often said, sometimes sadly true, that blood can be thinner than water, especially when significant material interests are at stake. Secrets that one thought were buried forever with the deceased that are sometimes dredged up by family members themselves. Not to clarify the truth, but to serve as weapons to discredit opponents, to protect a so-called family reputation, or simply out of an insatiable greed. The small lesson here, perhaps, is that even the closest of blood ties can become incredibly fragile, easily exploited. When confronted with the temptations of money and power, the reputation of a family, so painstakingly built, is sometimes defended through means that are anything but honorable. Faced with Julian's relentless attacks, Nathaniel and Leo found themselves at a difficult crossroads. They could continue to eye each other with suspicion, allowing Julian to easily achieve his objectives, or they had to find some way to truly cooperate, at least to deal with their common enemy. The information Julian was disseminating, whether fabricated or merely exaggerated, had nonetheless planted unsettling seeds of doubt in both their minds. Was Cassian's legacy truly a vast fortune, or merely a tangled web of legal troubles and undisclosed debts? Nathaniel gazed out the window. Golden Deer Valley appeared hauntingly beautiful in the fading twilight. He knew then, to survive this game, and to uncover the truth behind Julian's carefully constructed narrative, he could no longer afford to remain passive, to merely defend. The time had come for him to make his own moves that might surprise everyone, including Leo. The real battle was not just about deciphering Cassian's mysteries, but also about fighting against the forces determined to bury everything. The days that followed at Golden Deer Valley were steeped in a palpable tension, an atmosphere so thick you could almost cut it with a knife. The information Julian had unleashed, though not entirely verified, had nonetheless sown considerable doubt in the minds of both Nathaniel and Leo regarding the true worth of the estate. They continued their attempts to decipher Cassian's mementos. But now, each new discovery seemed to carry an added layer of complex meaning. Another profound question about the man Cassian truly was. Nathaniel understood, with growing clarity, that if he merely reacted passively to Julian's attacks, he, and likely Leo as well, would soon be backed into a corner. Their cautious cooperation was as fragile as a spider's thread, liable to snap at any moment should one of them feel their personal interest more severely threatened. No, he could not simply sit by and wait, hoping for a stroke of good luck. Cassian had devised a game, and Julian was trying to rig it. It was time for Nathaniel to reshuffle the deck himself. During the long, restless nights in that opulent yet cold mansion, Nathaniel found his thoughts drifting back through his years with Cassian. He recalled their conversations, sometimes playful, sometimes intensely serious, secrets Cassian had shared only with him in their most private moments. And then a memory surfaced, something he had almost forgotten, or perhaps had subconsciously chosen to suppress. It was of a small, green leather-bound journal, one that Cassian always kept meticulously hidden in a secret drawer beneath his desk in his private library, a sanctuary where even the most trusted household staff rarely ventured. Cassian had once referred to it, half jokingly, half seriously, as his insurance policy, a place where he recorded the less than savory truths of the world he navigated. A daring resolve began to form in Nathaniel's mind. He knew this was a gamble, a significant risk. If that journal truly contained what Cassian had implied, it could be a double-edged sword. It might provide leverage against Julian, but it could also expose other, darker facets of Cassian's life, and perhaps entangle Nathaniel himself in unforeseen complications. Seizing an opportunity one morning when Leo had stepped out onto the estate grounds to clear his head, as he put it, Nathaniel slipped into Cassian's library. The room still held the faint, lingering scent of old paper and the subtle aroma of the pipe tobacco Cassian had favored. Heart pounding in his chest, he approached the antique desk. It didn't take him long to locate the secret compartment, and there, nestled inside, lay the small, green leather-bound journal. Nathaniel didn't read it immediately. He carried it back to his own room, locked the door securely, and only then, with trembling hands, did he open its pages. What he read left him utterly stunned. It wasn't just a record of ordinary business transactions, but rather a collection of Cassian's astute, sometimes scathing, observations about his partners, his rivals, and even a few members of the Ward family. More critically, it contained details of unofficial agreements, unclear loans, and several investment schemes of dubious legality involving rather influential figures with whom Julian would most certainly not wish to be publicly associated. Cassian, in his own methodical way, had collected and documented everything, like a spider weaving an intricate web of information for his own protection. That evening, during a rare moment of candid conversation with Leo, after both had expressed their frustration with the vagueness of Cassian's clues, Nathaniel placed the journal on the table between them. "I believe," he said slowly, deliberately, "we may have found a new weapon to deal with Julian." Leo looked at the journal, then at Nathaniel. His eyes narrowed in suspicion. When Nathaniel revealed a portion of its contents, size hands, just enough for Leo to grasp its potential impact, Leo's expression shifted from surprise to a kind of grudging, wary respect. Where did you find this?" Leo asked, his voice a little hoarse. "That's not important," Nathaniel replied. "What's important is how we decide to use it." This was Nathaniel's risky gambit. He didn't choose to take it directly to the lawyer, nor to publicize its entire contents. Instead, he intended to use it as a warning, a deterrent aimed squarely at Julian. He wanted Julian to know that if he continued his smear campaign, Nathaniel was prepared to drag everyone into a battle where the consequences would be unpredictable for all involved. In life, dear listeners, people are sometimes pushed into situations where they must make incredibly difficult choices, decisions that can alter the entire landscape of their circumstances, but which also carry significant inherent risks. Much like in a high-stakes game of chess, there are moments when a player must be willing to sacrifice a key piece or make a bold, unexpected move to break a stalemate and seize an opportunity for victory. The small lesson here, perhaps, is that truth, however stark or unpalatable it may be, possesses a power all its own, and the choice of when and how to bring that truth to light can sometimes be more critical than the truth itself. Nathaniel had chosen not to expose in everything, but to reveal just enough, a silent challenge. This act truly made Nathaniel a more formidable, more unpredictable player in Leo's eyes, and undoubtedly in Julian's as well. Once he learned of it, he was no longer merely the younger lover, grieving and waiting for fate to decide his future. He had shown himself to be a man of intellect and resolve, willing to engage in the complex game of power and intrigue that Cassian and the Ward family had laid out. That small, green, leather-bound journal now felt like a ticking time bomb, and Nathaniel, it seemed, held the detonator. The dynamics of the game had shifted once again, promising even more dramatic developments ahead. The emergence of the little green leather-bound journal truly did alter the landscape of their peculiar contest. Julian Ward, after a few feeble attempts to deny or diminish the significance of its recorded entries, was forced into a temporary, reluctant retreat. He knew Nathaniel was not bluffing. The pressure from those leaked newspaper articles and those officious letters of concern also, quite suddenly, ceased. Golden Deer Valley seemed quieter now, but it was a deceptive quiet, the charged stillness that often precedes a more significant storm. Nathaniel and Leo, though still harboring a degree of mutual suspicion, now shared a more clearly defined common objective to decipher. Once and for all, the final challenges Cassian had laid out for them. It was no longer solely about the inheritance. It was about unearthing the truth, a truth both men felt they deserved to know. Nathaniel's journal had opened one door, but they both sensed that it was not the final one. One of the last mementos Cassian had instructed them to reflect upon together was an antique music box, crafted from wood intricately inlaid with mother-of-pearl. It didn't play a complete, recognizable melody, but rather emitted short, disjointed musical phrases, seemingly at random, whenever someone touched it. Alongside it lay a slim volume of poetry by an obscure author. Many of its pages dog-eared, with handwritten notes scribbled in a type of almost invisible ink, an ink that only revealed itself when held under a very specific angle of light. Many days passed as they grappled with these fragmented clues. Nathaniel, with his innate sensitivity, tried to string together those random musical snippets, hoping to form a coherent tune. Leo, drawing upon the extensive literary knowledge he had once spoken of with such pride when discussing Cassian, attempted to decode the hidden meanings within the poems and those enigmatic, near-invisible annotations. Then, one late afternoon when both were on the verge of utter despair, Leo suddenly let out a soft, almost inaudible gasp. He had just discovered that if the first letters of each handwritten note in the poetry book were arranged in a particular sequence, a sequence hinted at by the most frequently repeated musical notes from the antique music box, they formed a complete sentence. That sentence read, "Where love first began is also where truth awaits." Where love first began, Nathaniel murmured to himself. His mind instantly flashed back. It was a small, unassuming cafe by the lake, the place where he and Cassian had first met, a chance encounter that had irrevocably changed both their lives. They decided to return to the city to seek out that old cafe. It was still there, though time had wrought a few subtle changes. Guided by an inexplicable intuition, Nathaniel made his way to the old, worn table in the corner where they had once sat for hours, lost in conversation. He ran his hand over the smooth, aged wood, and then his fingertips brushed against a tiny, almost imperceptible ridge. It was a minuscule secret drawer, cleverly disguised. Inside, there was no money, no jewels, only a tiny, ornate key and a carefully sealed letter, addressed to Nathaniel and Leo, my final companions. Nathaniel's hand trembled slightly as he broke the seal. Leo stood beside him, holding his breath. Cassian's familiar handwriting filled the page, yet it seemed to carry an air of distant formality. In the letter, Cassian did not explain his actions in the way they might have expected. Instead, he wrote of his own profound loneliness, of the immense pressures and the crushing weight of expectations he had always carried upon his shoulders. He wrote of how he had seen in Nathaniel a vibrant freshness, a zest for life that he himself had long since lost. And he wrote that he had seen in Leo a deep understanding, a soulful resonance that he had always craved. Then Cassian wrote, and this, dear listeners, was the final unmasking. I know that both of you will find this letter. I also knew about Nathaniel's green journal, just as I knew about the mementos that Leo has always cherished as his own private treasures. Leo started slightly, his hand reflexively going to his breast pocket. I did not create this game to torment you, or for my own perverse amusement. I created it because I wanted you both, somehow, to truly see each other, to see the different facets of my own being reflected in each of you, and perhaps, in doing so, to see yourselves more clearly. That small key, Cassian continued, will open a modest safe deposit box at the bank. Within it, I have left enough for both of you to make a fresh start should you so choose. But more importantly, it also contains irrefutable evidence of certain questionable transactions involving a few members of the Ward family, particularly Julian. I knew Julian would not leave you in peace. Use it as a tool for your own protection or to demand a measure of justice. The choice is yours. And then the letter's final passage. I have lived a life behind too many masks. Nathaniel, Leo, I do not ask for your forgiveness, but I do hope that you will learn something from my mistakes. Do not let fear or the judgments of others dictate the course of your lives. Live authentically, true to what you believe. That, in the end, is the most precious legacy of all. The letter slipped from Nathaniel's grasp. Both he and Leo stood in stunned silence. So, this was the truth. There was no real winner in Cassian's game of love. Only wounded individuals, exposed secrets, and the stark, unvarnished reality that even a man as powerful and intelligent as Cassian was riddled with contradictions. His actions often bafflingly inconsistent. He was both the architect of their ordeal, and yet, in his own convoluted way, he had also attempted to orchestrate an escape route for them, albeit one fraught with trials. It is often said, that truth will out, that a secret, no matter how deeply buried or cleverly disguised, will eventually find its way into the light. Sometimes it emerges from the most unexpected quarters, from clues that seem inanimate, yet hold within them an entire unspoken narrative. The small lesson here, perhaps, is that deceit, regardless of its intent, will always leave a trail of consequences, not just for others, but for the deceiver as well. Cassian had spent his life constructing elaborate facades, only to use his death in this intricate game to try and peel back, if only partially, the truth about himself and those around him. The play had now reached its denouement. The most significant secrets had been laid bare. Nathaniel and Leo looked at each other, no longer with the eyes of rivals, but as two souls who had shared an unwelcome, arduous journey, two men who had just unearthed a truth too vast, too complex to easily digest. Before them lay decisions about that final inheritance, about the evidence against Julian, and more importantly, about the separate paths each would now choose for himself after this velvet curtain finally, truly, fell. The revelation contained in Cassian's final letter settled upon Nathaniel and Leo like a shroud, heavy and irreversible. The grand game was over, its intricate mechanisms laid bare. There was no triumphant winner, no clear vanquished, only two men left to sift through the emotional wreckage and the unsettling clarity of Cassian's complex, manipulative, yet strangely poignant farewell. In the days that followed, a new kind of quiet descended upon Golden Deer Valley. It was not the tense silence of suspicion, but rather the introspective calm that follows a storm. Nathaniel and Leo, now possessing the small key and the weighty knowledge of Cassian's true intentions, found themselves in an unspoken, almost somber accord. They visited the bank as Cassian had instructed. The safe deposit box yielded a sum of money that was indeed substantial, enough for new beginnings, as he had promised, and alongside it lay the meticulously documented evidence against Julian Ward and certain illicit dealings of the larger Ward family, a potent weapon Cassian had armed them with from beyond the grave. They did not, however, immediately unleash this weapon in a blaze of retribution. Perhaps Cassian's final words about living authentically, free from the machinations of others, had resonated more deeply than they initially realized. Instead, through Mr. Finch, a carefully worded message was conveyed to Julian. It was a message that needed no elaborate explanation. The mere suggestion of the evidence they now held was enough. Julian Ward, for the first time since Cassian's passing, was effectively silenced. His schemes to control the estate or discredit them nullified. The Ward family trust he had so eagerly anticipated managing would remain a distant dream. As for the inheritance stipulated in Cassian's bizarre will, the grand estate of Golden Deer Valley itself, the art collection, the investments, it now seemed almost like a poisoned chalice. Who had truly won the right to it? Who had understood Cassian best? The questions felt hollow, the prize tainted by the emotional labyrinth they had been forced to navigate. In the end, Nathaniel and Leo made a decision that perhaps Cassian himself, in his most hidden heart, might have hoped for, or at least respected. They chose not to fight over it. They agreed, with the assistance of Finch, to a quiet liquidation of the main assets, the proceeds to be divided, not as victors of a game, but as two individuals who had shared an extraordinary and extraordinarily trying experience. Golden Deer Valley, that monument to Cassian's wealth and solitude, would pass into other hands. They each took the portion Cassian had separately willed them in the safe deposit box, and with it, a profound understanding of the cost of secrets and the weight of a complicated legacy. And so, dear listeners, what became of them? Life, as it often does, moved on, carrying them down separate paths. Nathaniel, it is said, used his share to create something meaningful, something that perhaps honored the sliver of genuine connection he once felt with Cassian. Before the shadows grew too long, he sought a life quieter, more genuine, far removed from the gilded cages of wealth and power. Leo, always the more enigmatic of the two, also forged a new path. Perhaps he finally found the peace to cherish his own memories of Cassian, untangled from the pain of secrecy and the bitterness of the posthumous game. He had, after all, been acknowledged, his existence brought into the light, a small victory in itself. The ashes of power, of ambition built on artifice and control, often leave a bitter taste. Cassian Ward's legacy was not one of simple love or straightforward generosity, but a tangled skein of manipulation, loneliness, and a desperate, flawed attempt at connection, or perhaps even at redemption. He had set a stage for chaos, yet in doing so, he inadvertently paved the way for a harsh kind of truth to emerge. The small lesson here, if there is one to be found amidst such complexity, might be this: that the truest inheritances are not always those of material wealth. Sometimes, they are the lessons learned in the crucible of difficult experiences, the clarity gained when illusions are shattered, the quiet strength found in choosing one's own path, free from the entanglements of another's making. For Nathaniel and Leo, the game was over. What remained was the quiet echo of Cassian's final wish to live authentically. And perhaps, in their own separate ways, they finally began to do just that. Thank you for joining me on this rather winding journey. May your own stories be filled with more light and less shadow.